Okay, shall we? You think we're mostly here? Oh yeah, that's it. Okay, cool. Yeah. Grass? Good? Good enough? Okay. Cool. Okay, I think we're going to get started. I am using this silly microphone because Margaret is in the States and is live streaming in because this is really tied into her work with measuring and evaluation. So pardon the extra formality of using the microphone. I hope that this will be informal and a discussion amongst anyone that has questions about this, ideas about these topics. So please feel free to just stop me and ask questions. Also feel free to float in and out if you have to go and, in 5 minutes or in 20 minutes, feel free to just walk out. I won't be offended whatsoever. And we'll try to wrap up by about 4:30, which could be tight because I have lots of things to share with you, but I'll try to go quickly and leave some time at the end so people who want can stay and have discussion. And as you're ready to go, feel free. So, quick synopsis of the project. The idea here was to finally take the time to go back and review what we've learned after doing admissions at ALA for the past 7 years. So we set up a system of different criteria that we're using to evaluate each application. And the question was essentially, how well is that working? Are the things that we look at in the application actually correlated with student success here at ALA and beyond? And what can we learn from the student outcomes in the last couple years to help us iterate on our admissions process and potentially revise or refine what it is that we're looking for? So we broke up the project into basically 2 chunks, a qualitative study and a quantitative study. So for the qualitative piece, I interviewed 15 faculty, many of you in this room, as well as some of our alumni, and asked them questions about what they think really matters for students to succeed here at ALA and beyond. And then I also asked, when you think of students who've struggled here, what are some common themes there? And then started to try to dig into the patterns that we were seeing around what traits really matter for success. And then the quantitative piece, we basically did some work with Tanacho and Chris to identify students in recent years that have been highly successful or who have struggled at ALA, and then looked back at their admissions applications and run a bunch of analyses on which factors were the strongest predictors of their success at the end of their time at ALA. So here's just an overview of the broad projects that we were doing. First, we had to figure out how to define what success means, which is a big question. And so we started to think about whether we should have a success score for our graduates that pulls 5 or 6 different components, and we added up. In the end, it felt like that was going to be contrived and hard to do given the data that we had. So we sort of took a shortcut for now of having Chris and Tanacho identify students that were really successful from the last couple years. Do you want to say a couple words about how you did that process?
So in choosing the students that were selected for this particular study, we basically came up with the list of students based on the last 2 graduating classes, of students basically who, one group is a group of students that made the most of their time here at African Leadership Academy, and we felt they got the most out of this experience. And then another group of students who perhaps for various reasons were not able to make the most of their time at African Leadership Academy. So successful and unsuccessful are very simplified terms, and we're not writing off these students. And those students can still be poised to transform the African continent. But we were looking at success metrics based on how the students did when they were at ALA. So that's kind of a basic overview of that.
It's more about helping us find, overall, the goal would be to help us figure out how to find each student that has the potential, the highest level of potential to transform Africa. It's not about finding our admissions mistakes and sort of second guessing those, because all the students, for the most part, who have come here have been amazing students, and we just want to make sure we don't miss the ones who are finalists who could be incredible, but we weren't able to admit. So we want to kind of get that finalist level decision making right. So we collected some data interviewing people from all across campus and also collecting information like university placement, SAT scores, academic performance here. One thing that we realized throughout this process is if we want to be able to do this continually, we're going to need to make it a more streamlined pipeline of data from admissions to student life here on campus, to university guidance, to lifelong engagement, because right now it requires somebody getting Excel spreadsheets from 5 or 6 different people to tell the story of an ALA student's experience from admission through their early career. So hopefully that's something that we can work on as an institution in the coming years. So the next slide shows essentially our summary of what we learned from the interviews. So I'll show you some of the actual text from all the interviews in a moment, but this is the synthesis of the factors that we as faculty and some of our alumni thought were most important in differentiating our most successful students from ones who didn't fully take advantage of the ALA experience. So a number of the categories here are sort of leadership or entrepreneurial spirit related. The drive to have a goal and to continually be pushing towards that, and the energy to sustain that. Proactivity, including the ability to ask for help and leverage resources. Resilience, the ability to overcome obstacles and find ingenious ways to just keep going towards your goal, even when things keep thwarting you or when you're having a tough spot in life. And then there are some sort of intellectual components, critical thinking, curiosity, which also includes the curiosity to be open-minded to the people around you and to what type of impact you want to have across the continent. Collaboration and teamwork were a common theme. And then purpose, which is sort of tied to the mission around Passion for Africa, of students who have some kind of purpose that's really driving them, a sense of responsibility and commitment. So to give you a sense of how we got to those 7, basically I took all the information that you all gave us, or the faculty interviews, and tried to group them according to sort of like buckets of information, and then pick out which were the most common and what's sort of the one word that we could use to capture that. So this wasn't done by some like statistical analysis. It was more just a synthesis of what we kept hearing over and over. So those same themes of drive, resilience, proactivity came up over and over again. Curiosity. Critical thinking is one that came up less times, but was something that Chris Bradford felt is really important, because I think we tend in these categories to assume that a student has sort of the baseline level where they can do the academics at ALA and they're ready to be successful here as students, and then we're sort of asking, okay, what more if they're going to really be the one that transforms Africa? So by having critical thinking in there, we're hoping to capture also some of what takes to kind of meet the threshold so that you're not drowning in the academics at ALA and can put the other skills to use. And then it continues to go on. There's some categories that didn't get captured in the top 7 but are also important around mindset, confidence, time management, just a student that stands out in our applicant pool. So there's more to dive into, but I hope that those big 7 sort of really do capture what was most important in the interviews. Any questions about this before, or thoughts, comments before we go on? Okay, we'll come back to it. I wanted to take one moment on Passion for Africa, which I know Diego and I were having sort of a side conversation about. I don't expect you to read this. I'm sorry, it's so text heavy. But basically, we tried to pull out Passion for Africa in particular because it seemed a little bit controversial. Some of the interviews were saying this is not important, and others were saying it's the most important factor. The ones who were saying it was not important were saying things like, Passion for Africa grows and develops with time it isn't an important admissions metric. It's like diversity. We don't necessarily need it up front. We can teach students. Or if you spend 2 years at ALA and you don't care about Africa, then it's a lost cause. So this sense of like, if they come here with a passion for their community, maybe their country, the passion for the whole continent is something that might be instilled more here at ALA. So it seemed like by the end of it, we felt that there was a common theme that having a sense of purpose and a dedication to reaching beyond yourself, working for common good, helping inspire and motivate other people, that was really important, but it didn't have to manifest as a knowledge of every single country in Africa and, you know, intellectual passion for Pan-African issues before they come to ALA. Does that resonate with people? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. To pull out a few patterns of students who struggled at ALA, it was students who were confused about why they were here, so missing that sense of purpose, and therefore sort of missing the match with ALA. A sense of entitlement, which could be a student who comes with a lot of hype, like, I'm the top in my country, and isn't sure what they're going to get out of ALA besides sort of the brand or the college admission that might come with it. Students who are unwilling to be challenged could be in that category. So there could be really bright students but don't like to do things that are difficult or unpleasant. Students who aren't self-driven, sometimes academically unprepared, ones who didn't reach out for help or didn't acknowledge that they needed help. And then sort of a bucket around ones who just never settled at ALA. They had external factors maybe that were always weighing on their mind or just weren't able to make strong connections with peers. And again, we didn't really use this list for much to pick out like, oh, that was where we made a mistake, but more to look at the flip side and say, okay, that means we really are looking for students who do have that clear vision of why ALA is the right place for them, are self-driven, do have the academic criteria to be successful here, and are ones that we think will be proactive and ask for help. And one last thought on this interview section. It came out a lot that of course, this process that we've done is sort of looking at what does the student have coming in that we think they'll carry with them coming out. But of course, there's this big factor of what happens while they're at ALA and what role we all play in helping them realize the potential that they come in with or that we saw in the admissions process. And so a few different interviewers and a number of our alumni talked about that as a huge factor. Like, having a really good advisor can make the difference between struggling at ALA and being a real success story at ALA. So I think there's some extra thought that can go into kind of what we learned from this of how do we make sure that the advising programs are strong across the board so every student has a really great advisor and a really great connection with adults here. I loved this quote from Joseph. He said, "One key to success is connection with the ALA community." He's talking about why he's been successful. He said, "It makes a big difference to have people who care about you and believe in you, people to rely on, people who call and ask, how are you doing? That makes me strong." I just loved, like, there were a number of alumni that said the same thing. So it's pretty cool to see it really is a blend of their potential coming in and then what we do here. Thoughts or questions on either of those? Okay. So the next section was to take that information about what criteria, those sort of 7 traits that we thought really mattered, and figure out how that maps with the criteria that we're using now. So here's a little overview of the criteria that the admissions process uses right now. We say we're looking for these 5 categories: academic achievement, leadership potential, entrepreneurial spirit, passion for Africa, and dedication for service. We also sometimes talk about courage, perseverance, and shared values. So those are kind of things we say to the outside world are important. Then the next sort of these green ones in this section talk about what we ask people to rate students on while they're reviewing applications, which are mostly the same as the 5 criteria, but also have a few other categories. And then when we get to the finalist day, it's all over the map. That's this long list is what we look at in the finalist interview. It includes things like opportunity mindset, humility, compassion, teamwork, willingness to fail. And then there's like additional rubrics for all the other activities that happen during finalist weekend. So we realized that one of the challenges is, well, I don't know if is not to throw in the whole kitchen sink in admissions and be like, a student needs to do 30 different things to be a successful finalist, and to try to distill down, like, what are the few traits that we think really matter, and design a process that allows us to hone in on those. So this is the structure that Tanacho, Chris, and I were chatting about this morning as a way to kind of map from the criteria that we talk about externally to the 7 criteria that our faculty and alumni think are most important. So these are the original 5, and then there's some sub-bullets that I don't think we look at all that often, these middle ones. Okay, but 7 years ago when they wrote the admissions criteria, those were in there. And then what we've thought about, the way we've thought about reframing it is to still externally, we're going to keep talking about these 5 criteria, and this still drives our process. But what we want to do now is focus on the underlying skills that build up to your leadership potential or build up to your entrepreneurial spirit. So what are the traits that we can identify in the application, in the finalist weekend, that get us to those 5 criteria? And so we've framed that as using these 3 buckets: intellectual readiness, which includes their academic performance so far and their critical thinking skills; their leadership readiness, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're, the president of everything in their school right now, but that they have the drive, the proactivity, the resilience, and the collaborative orientation that they can be great leaders poised to transform Africa after time at ALA. And then that they have a strong sense of purpose, which could include this idea of curiosity to discover exactly what that purpose will be. So they don't have to have decided that it's clean water in Africa that really matters. It's that they are really driven and determined to make a difference and to keep asking questions to figure out what the right match for them will be. And that also includes an ability to articulate in a genuine way why ALA is the place for them. Any questions on that? Make sense? Okay. And then we're going to do some work, this is work in progress, but of mapping out all these sort of traits that we're looking for and where in the application we're going to find them. Admissions has always had one of these evidence criteria matrices, and we just need to keep refining it now that we have a better sense of what traits we think are most important. Okay, now we're going to dive into some pretty graphs and fun analysis that we did on the applications from the 45 students that Tanacho and Chris pulled out from the last couple years. So there's no names in this, but we'll show you some aggregate numbers about things that we learned about reader scores, entrance exams, and teacher recommendations, and how those do or do not correlate with success for students here at ALA. So the reader ratings, we thought they were going to be, at least I thought, that was going to be pretty highly correlated with success. So I thought that students who were getting the best scores from the readers might be stronger students here at ALA, and the ones that we'd been more uncertain about in the admissions process might not do so well at ALA. It turns out there's a pretty slim correlation among this admitted student group between the ones that got the high scores and ones that got low scores. That's on aggregate, pretty low correlation. But at the outliers, that hypothesis is true. So you can basically see on these graphs, each bubble, the size of the bubble represents how many students got that score. And the x-axis is the first reader and the y-axis is the second reader. So the highest you could get would be a 5 from each of the 2 readers. And there are 4 students who were in the successful group that got that 5, and there was 1 student that struggled here at ALA that initially got a 5. On the flip side, on the outliers on the other end, you can see like anyone here meant they got a 2, so one of the lowest scores from at least 1 reader. And there are only 2 students who got 2s from both readers. 2 means soft reject. So neither reader was that excited about them. And it sort of makes sense that a couple of these students that had those lowest marks were students who struggled. So this is the key up here. A 5 meant clear accept, 4 is soft accept, 3 uncertain, 2 soft reject, 1 reject. So what we saw though is that in the middle here, there's just there's a lot of students, whether they're successful or not, getting these scores like one reader gives them a 4 and the other one gives them a 5, or they get 4s from both readers, those sorts of things. And Chris's feeling was that our admissions, the final committee, does a pretty good job of sussing out, regardless of whether whatever the readers rated, of making good decisions that sometimes override the reader scores, because the reader scores ultimately aren't that strongly correlated with how a student does here at ALA. Do you want to add anything about that process? Okay. Really what we saw is that we need to probably train our readers. Yeah, we probably need to train our readers better and get more spread across the rubric to have the reader scores be reliable. Yeah, Shags?
What the correlation actually was between the two?
Yeah, so it's the R-squared. Yeah, do you want to? Sorry. Sorry. The R-squared value is 0.02, so it explains like 2% of the variation. The average score for a successful student was 4.0, and the average score for an unsuccessful student, this is across all the readers, not the 2 scores combined, was 3.8. So very little difference on aggregate. We also looked at the first read and then the final read. So that the bubble charts you just saw were from the final read. So each application gets read 4 times, 2 first reads and 2 final reads. So the final reads have a lot more information incorporated into them, including teacher recommendations and everything that happens at the finalist weekend. However, we saw in the data that the first read that we do just based on the application and not having met them in person and not having read their teacher recs or anything is correlated just as well within this admitted group again. So within the students that we decide ultimately to admit, we almost could have read them just as well in the our very first cut of reading the application, at least in terms of sort of what the numbers show on the correlation. Part of this, we think, is because the first read process forces readers to use a tighter rubric and differentiate their scores more. So it's much harder to give like top scores, all 5s, let's say, in the first read process than it is in the second read process. So one thing that we're taking away is we've got to train readers how to use the rubric really clearly and cap how many students they can say are excellent or outstanding and getting the top ratings so that we can spread it out and see the difference even among a really qualified group of applicants. Any other questions of the reading process before? Yeah.
To what extent were you able to tell how much people weren't putting in their comments? Like, what if the readers are actually good, but it's not coming through from their writing, but it's coming through from their selecting? Is that something that
Only we didn't do any analysis on like how many words they wrote or anything like that. When I was inputting this data, so like I would just look at the reader sheets and enter what scores they'd put, and sometimes I'd skim what they wrote at the same time, and it seemed to me to match up fairly well with the numbers that they're putting. So if they're putting a 2, they're usually writing a nice statement about what their concerns are about this particular applicant. So on the outset, I didn't see enough to make me think there's going to be a big discrepancy between the scores that they're rating them and how well they're communicating that. But obviously another interesting thing to do would be actually go back and really read those reader sheets and see what we could learn from the way they're written and how well people advocate for students or not in that process. Does that sort of answer your question?
I was more curious around sort of what was unsaid and how people look at the students. You know, like some people can like intuitively look at someone and be like, you would be an A, like, but they don't really know or can clearly articulate what
why.
Such that it's like if you're trying to train people, you can't really say, well, this is what we look for, but the people who see it and find it know what they look for.
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's basically what we're trying to do with the interviews is ask people who've read hundreds or thousands of files at this point, like, can you now, upon reflection, say what it is that you were really looking for? And that's where we got sort of that list of 7 traits, which is interesting because it's not the 5 traits that we said we were looking for. So now we want to try to design a process that says, like, our experts intuitively were actually using, resilience and proactivity and purpose as their guiding principles, or at least they think so when they're forced to articulate it. Can we now design a process that helps new readers start using those traits earlier in their careers? Does that make sense? Cool. Lai? Mm-hmm.
They kind of like almost get it right most of the time. Is that they use it in different rubric for analysis? Maybe I missed that.
Yeah, I don't totally understand either. I might hand it to you to explain a little bit about how final committee works and what you think works there.
Yeah, so the final committee doesn't necessarily have a different rubric. What they do is each finalist gets a review sheet, a 1-page review sheet from, in this case, 2 different readers. And basically, beyond just looking at whether a student got a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, or 5, they also look at the context of, like, how did they do on their first round application? What are their academics looking like? So it's almost like reading between the lines, and part of it is that members of the final committee, I mean, in the early days, it was just Fred and Chris, right? So Chris has sat on final committee since the beginning, and part of it, I think, is the consistency of people being on final committee several years in a row. And I think that's probably been one of the biggest things. And our challenge is to actually put some of the stuff down on paper so that we're not overly reliant on what's inside Chris's head or, people on final committee. So that's actually the next biggest challenge for us, to make sure that we provide more information to readers so that they can give just as accurate an assessment as someone on final committee. So, yeah.
Okay, so the next piece that we looked at are yeah, Tico.
In terms of screening readers, were you able to desegregate your analysis by reader to see if there's some readers that are really good and some that are bad?
I would love to do that. We didn't do that. I think the sample size is too small right now because we only had 45 students, and so we would only have maybe like 10 reads in the pool from any given reader. So one of my big recommendations is let's capture these final read scores and decisions all the time so that we could easily do that exact analysis. I used to do that when I was at Dartmouth. I would pull all my reads and look at what I rated them and then like what the final decision was and try to figure out where I was missing the boat, like when the dean was saying something different than I was, and use that to train myself. But we just haven't been capturing that data. Like, we have all these reader sheets, but it took me sitting down and typing them to get it all in one Excel spreadsheet. So I think if we start putting that data in, then we could start doing that analysis in the future. Okay, so entrance exams. This is an exam that students take on finalist weekend. So they sit down and write an exam, sort of like the SATs, that has a verbal component and a quantitative component, and then they also write an essay. And we wanted to see whether their scores on that entrance exam were highly correlated with success, at least in the sort of holistic view that Chris and Tanacho had. And so basically what we saw is that there isn't much correlation, also meaning that I think Chris and Tanacho were not just looking at their GPAs or their SAT scores when they made their decision about which students they would call successful and poised to transform Africa and leveraging the ALA experience well. So the entrance exam, the successful students are the blue, and the orange is students who struggled while they were here at ALA. And on the combined one, so there's the average score for successful students was 28.7, and for unsuccessful it was 28.0, and that's out of 54. So it's a hard exam, but very slight differences between the two on aggregate. So the regression was the R-squared is 0.0041. So basically no correlation between how they did on the exam and how they did here at ALA. We still think the exam is helpful in setting a minimum bar. Like these are all admitted students. So if we threw in a bunch of students that were the lowest performing on the exam, who we didn't end up admitting, they might have been ones that really struggled here at ALA. So we're just working with that admitted student set. It also is helpful in telling us where else to look in the application, and we can talk about that in a moment. Out of curiosity, I sort of ended up looking at the individual students who were the highest and lowest performers in the two categories. So these are successful students. These were the 3 successful students with the lowest scores, and this is their quant, verbal, and then total. And then we did the same among students who struggled. And basically what you see of highly successful ALA graduates, like poster children for ALA, 2 of them got a 16 in their combined score, which is the lowest of this entire set of 45 students that we used. And then the lowest from an unsuccessful student was 17. And then on the high side, you see students who are very successful, who had very high test scores. And then you see almost the same test scores coming out of students who did not succeed. So basically, we can identify students who are intellectually ready for ALA, even if they don't have great exam scores, as long as they're above sort of a minimum threshold. And then on the flip side, we see students that test really well, but in our new sort of lingo, maybe they're not leadership ready. In other words, they social, emotional wise, they might struggle at ALA. Maybe they haven't had to do anything hard like ALA before, or it doesn't match their values and their sense of purpose. And so they flounder here, even though clearly they've got the smarts to keep up academically. So one thing that we're thinking about is how we use this information also to train readers. So here were some of our takeaways. We want to give readers more information about how to view scores in context. So give them what was the average score within this country, or the average score for students in a particular income bracket. So we looked at how the entrance exam scores vary depending on family income. Students who are considered low-income students, which we said meant they pay tuition fees of less than $5,000 US dollars per year here at ALA. Their average score was 25, whereas students that are above that, their average score was 31 combined score. So you see a pretty big gap between students depending on their income level. So the point there is that we want to help readers use that in context so they can say, okay, given this country, this background, this income, this is still a really strong test score, and not just rely on the number that they see on the page. We saw that the test scores by themselves are not that predictive, but hopefully it tells you where to look next. So if they have really high scores, then we want to start asking questions about their work ethic, their drive, their values, and whether they match ALA. We really want to dig into those. If they have really low scores, maybe they have a great leadership story, but we've got to find evidence that they can persevere academically and keep up here. So it kind of helps the reader directionally orient, even though by itself it's not going to be that helpful. There's also a writing exam, which I didn't really talk about because we don't use it that much, except to tell, like, do we think their English is baseline good enough? And so one of our ideas is we have them sitting there spending 30 minutes doing this writing exam. Let's ask a really great question and use that to test some of the skills that we don't have enough information about, maybe critical thinking, curiosity, some of the soft skills and traits that we're most interested in digging into. So Tanacha and I have been talking about what questions we might want to ask and how to design a rubric that uses that time for more than just checking their English fluency. Okay, last section, teacher recommendations. This is the most fun and exciting because unlike test scores, these actually are really helpful indicators is what we found. And in our process, I think the readers had been sort of dismissing a little bit the teacher recommendations with the idea like they're always positive. How do you tell the difference between like one nice set of things and another nice set of praise? And we tried to drill into how you really can tell the difference once we saw the data. So there are 2 questions that the teachers respond to at the very end of the application that are the ones that are easiest to analyze from a quantitative lens. So the first one is, how would you rank this student as compared to others you've seen in your career? Top 2 to 3 students in my career, top 5%, 10%, 25%, 50%, or below average. And then overall, I recommend this student for admission to ALA enthusiastically, strongly, with reservations, cautiously, or not at all. So looking at those, we combined those two scores, and then these pie charts show sort of the different scores that students who struggled and students who are successful got. So students who are successful, this 48% and 34% here are some combination of 4s and 5s. And then you only have about 18, almost 20% of the scores were anything other than 4s and 5s across the board from the teachers. Whereas students who struggled have much more diversity. They were getting some 1s, some 2s, some 3s, some 4s, some 5s. And it's a little bit clearer here. The x-axis here is how they were ranked compared to other students, and then the y-axis is that overall recommendation. We translated enthusiastically means 5, strongly means 4, etc. And same thing with the rank, like top 2 to 3 in my career is a 5, top 5% is, or top 10% is a 4, etc. So a couple things to note. One is you clearly see the successful students are all in the top right corner, and the students who struggled are more all over the map. Again, the size of the bubble represents how many students got that combination of scores. So 21, so fully half of the recommendations that we had for successful students ranked them both 5. So top 2 to 3 students in my career, and they were recommended enthusiastically. Whereas that is only 4 students out of the group who struggled. You also see very little movement across the overall recommendation. So basically all the teachers said, I recommend enthusiastically or strongly. They didn't use the rest of the scale. So one of our insights is that if we want to get differentiation between really strong students who are going out of their way to apply to ALA, they're active in their communities, we've got to change the scales so that they're more like this one, where the lowest score, this is below average, but that's still top 50%. And then it just moves up and up so that we can try to pull out who are the truly outstanding among a pool of really great students. And this shows a little bit more what I was mentioning there, that the rank, how would you rank this student, provided a lot more differentiation. We were able to use the whole scale, whereas the overall recommendation question, it's 76% of students who struggled and 91% of successful students got the top enthusiastic recommendation. So it's just not very helpful to us. Whereas the other one, we can definitely start pulling out. If they're not giving them a top mark, it's much more likely that they're a student who might struggle here at ALA. Yeah?
Do we ask teachers to comment on those 7 criteria for success currently, or do we ask them to specifically talk about purpose or being proactively?
We don't ask that right now. The questions that we ask, the open-ended questions, the first one is what words are the first words that come to mind to describe this student, and then we ask them sort of how the student is unique, whether we think this student has strong leadership potential, etc. But after this analysis, we're now revising the teacher recommendation, and I'll talk about this. We want to build into the rubric these 7 traits that we think, or at least some of them, that we think are most important. So we're going to ask them to rank a few more categories, and we've also changed the way that we're asking some of the questions to try to get at the traits that we think matter most. So now that we know that teacher recommendations really are correlated with how the students perform here, we want to try to use that real estate on the application as well as we can and get as much information out of the people that actually know the students and have spent years with them, which is a real gift of insight for us in the process. So we did a little bit of analysis also on the first words question. We couldn't do the whole recommendations because it's just a lot of text. But we typed up the first words, and David helped me translate all the ones in French, that all of the teachers wrote about each of these students in our sample study, and looked at the difference between the successful students and the ones who struggled. The main difference, and I'll show you some word clouds in a moment, but is sort of the punchy nature and the level of enthusiasm that's conveyed through the teacher's words. It's notably stronger, though it's not statistical, but it's notable when you look at a whole stack of them, for the students who really thrive here at ALA than from the ones who do fine at ALA but weren't the ones coming to mind as people who really took advantage of the experience. So for successful students, we got a lot of comments around their work ethic, their motivation, their intellect. So like a comment would be a pupil who has never give up spirit, who is dedicated and committed to achieve the best results, and who always motivates others. Like that's a pretty great endorsement of a student, and that was correlated, or that student was successful here at ALA. And then for the ones who struggled, sometimes there were just red flags that maybe we missed. Like at the beginning, he didn't really like my subject, but the parents intervened, and then he showed me his qualities, which is like, And then a lot of them are like really nice, but they're not as punchy. They're wise, diligent, serious, or quiet but responsible, determined, methodical, invested in her work. So you can like feel a little bit how much the teacher wants to go to bat for that student. And then some, of course, there are false positives, and it's not perfectly correlated. There's some really, I included down here, a really great comment that was about a student who struggled. So it's not going to be an exact science, but I think knowing how to start interpreting the slight differences in reading between the lines will help us. And then here are the word clouds that go with it. So for students who were marked as successful, the size of the word represents the number of times that it showed up in that first word section of the teacher recs. Clearly, work ethic and being hardworking is the one that pops out. Intelligent pops out. And then you also see things like curious, motivated, brilliant, industrious, driven, skills, committed. Kind of lines up with some of the traits that we've been talking about. And then for the students who were not successful, this is also a slightly smaller sample size. Student, they are a student. It's great. Thank you, thank you. It's just, the language is just a little flatter. I mean, obviously things like because and student are flat, but diligent, hardworking pops up again, so, hard to draw full conclusions again, but studious, serious, work, good, not quite as punchy as some of the other ones. Yeah?
What do you do to find that leader is in this?
So I initially, the sample size is too small to really know, but I had this hypothesis. While I was typing them, I noticed like 3 in a row where they said leader and it was not a successful student. And it was, my little hypothesis is that there's a lot around demonstrated leadership roles in your school that isn't correlated with being highly successful here at ALA. So rather than saying like she inspires her classmates, they'll say like he is an excellent leader and prefect in the dorm or something. And I actually think sometimes those, like if what you think of is a designated leadership role that they have, I wonder if that's a sign that they're not as successful as someone who you can actually drill into the qualities underneath that leadership that really pop to mind for that student. So I don't know because the sample size is too small, but that was something I started to wonder about. Do we say the word leader and it actually doesn't mean much besides that you have a title? So our key takeaways are we really can trust the people who know the applicants personally. We should reframe our rubrics in positive terms to force dispersion. Obviously, all these kids are great, and we've got to figure out how to pull the truly outstanding ones out. And there's an opportunity to lean on these recommendations a little bit more, and that means following up to get recommendations where we don't have them. It also might mean where we have strong connections with the school, we could have some phone calls here and there to follow up on things. So we're running short on time, but I'll show you my last couple thoughts, next steps, and additional information. Our big next steps are to build really good rubrics around the traits that we've realized matter most, to design a measurable or more easily measurable admissions process so we can continue to iterate on this process. And that means defining success and incorporating more of your voices into that. So it's not always Chris and Tanacho in a vacuum being like, which students do we think were most successful? We'd like to build in a process where we have an annual review that involves different faculty voices to help us identify which students we think are the ones who are really poised to take on the ALA mission. And then every year be able to go back and look at these metrics in their application and keep refining our admissions process until we get it right. We're going to start incorporating these 7 underlying traits that we think matter based on these interviews, but we might realize one of two of them are really good and one or two of them is garbage, and I misinterpreted synthesizing all those interview results. So we can add things and we can take things out over time, but we've got to keep getting the data and keep hearing from lots of different voices to do that well. That's probably the most important piece. And then there's some thoughts around reader training and little fine-tuning that we want to do throughout the application process. So that's the big picture. I would love to take questions or hear thoughts or comments. I know we're running over, but maybe for just 2 or 3 minutes, it'd be great to hear other things on your mind or reactions. Yeah?
Can you say set age question?
Oh, this is, so one of my bullets was continue to focus on getting the right applicants, not more applicants. And so we have a lot of students apply who are too old for ALA or too young for ALA. And rather than getting them through the application pipeline and then reading them and denying them just because of their age, I was saying, can we add a question really early on, especially on the online application, like on the first page, so that you really can't go any further. If you say you're 22, it says, sorry, you're not eligible to apply. Think about these other opportunities. Maybe you want to do a GSP or whatever. So that would decrease the number of applications, might make your data look bad, that we won't have as many completed applications, but it's going to save us the hassle of reading students who aren't qualified from just a basic demographic level. So that's my point is let's get the right people in the pool. Let's not worry about what the numbers look like up front. Yeah, good question. Anything else? Yeah, Diego.
Do you do research on other organizations to get ideas that we could incorporate into our process here?
Not beyond the two that I've worked for. Did we look? Oh, a little bit. I mean, we pulled some ideas from the Stanford Business School recommendation form, the way they set up their list of criteria and their rubrics. I pulled a lot from the work that I did at Mountain School, and there we pulled from secondary high schools in the US. And then I pulled some thoughts from my work at Dartmouth, and then that means like broadly conversations that we had among the Ivies and their admission process. There could be, especially in the designing of the rubrics, I think it would be super helpful to look at best practices from other places. So if anybody has ideas, like great rubrics you've seen for anything, we were even looking at some of the work ALA's done in EL or with the final thesis, how we grade those. Like, we've come up with great rubrics. The PD rubric here is really good at doing the differentiating among really talented people and sort of forcing that dispersion. So that's a model for us, even like internally from other parts of ALA. So yeah, I think it's great to pull as much inspiration as we can from other places. And if you all have ideas or resources, I think it'd be great to share them with Tanacha. Yeah, it does.
How do you identify successful students and failures? What criteria do you look at to say they were successful?
Do you want to talk more about what your thought process was?
Sure. So we tried, this was for a short-term study, and we knew that, we weren't going to be able to have a large number of students to be able to do a larger study. So it was more like a qualitative list that we created, and the criteria we used was, some of it was academic, some of it was not. So some of the students that were award winners for their leadership values, for example, at graduation. So that was testament to some of the things that they've done here at African Leadership Academy, and that does not necessarily consider how they did academically. So kind of going with the same theme of the fact that ALA is looking to develop people beyond just academics, but people who are going to impact the continent in different areas and different places. We try to think of, who's been successful in the arts, who's been successful around sports programs and different things like that. So for the purposes of this study, it was just kind of like a list that me and Chris came up with, kind of from memory. But in future, this could be something that we can design a process by which, the community can give us feedback on which students did not do as well and which students did well, and how we can use that feedback to then analyze, their admissions process, going back to some of the things that Colleen did. So for now, for the purposes of this study, it was a list of different things, and it wasn't just academic success.
Okay, maybe we'll take one more and then we'll wrap up and hang out and you can ask individual questions. But yeah.
I think it's interesting to see that we have very low correlation between performance on our standard admissions exam, and that's similar as we see in the SAT, very little correlation between SAT score and success in college. And then the other thing I asked is that what we do see in terms of correlations between high school success in college is level of engagement in co-curricular or extracurricular activities. So, and I haven't seen our full admissions right here, but how good of a job do we do with refining kind of level of engagement within your school community as a measured attribute of an outcome?
Do you want to talk about it?
So for the activities, it's actually historically for this study we did not have a specific page that has a student list whatever their activities are. It might come out in the essays, but it's not necessarily a full list. But as of 2014, we started asking students. We have a full activities page which has arts, sports, cultural things, different things where they have the opportunity to say what activity they're involved in, how many hours a week they spend, and how many sort of days in a year they might spend on a particular activity. And what we actually do with that page is we use it in interviews as well. So if a student says, you know, I spend 40 hours a week farming, but I'm also a student, you kind of have to ask them, like, is that really real? Or exactly. So so it's something that we have added to the application to give the students an opportunity to talk about other areas that they're involved in beyond academics.
Can we change the question? What activity you're involved in, what you're passionate about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So there's the previous question, we used to ask the students to talk about something they're passionate about, and you kind of got vague answers. So we refined the question to ask a student to talk about the one activity that they are really engaged and immersed in, and to just give them an opportunity to elaborate on that. So we think that's going to have really interesting outcomes as well, and that's a new question for this year. Cool.
Thank you all for spending your afternoon with this. Obviously, happy to chat more. I'll just hang out for a little bit, and feel free to, you can get my email from Tanacho if you want to email me about these things beyond ALA time. So, thank you guys. Yeah.